Good afternoon and welcome to the January 10th, 2024 question and answer virtual lunch hour with Jason Killeen. I'm your host, Jason Killeen. I'm an assistant executive director with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. I just want to remind folks that the 2024 renewal period is still open. So folks do have an obligation to renew any record that has a status of local compliance underway or beyond. Records need to be renewed no later than February 29th. If folks fail to submit a renewal record, their records, of course, will be closed out and they would have to reapply if eligible. Other than that, we can hop into the questions.
Thank you, Jason. Good afternoon. Our first question comes from Harry S. Will there be a retail license lottery for social equity candidates in 2024?
Hopefully there'll be another lottery in 2024. There has not been a date set yet. And DCR will be transmitting a report to City Council for consideration about how many licenses would be made available through a lottery and what the criteria would be to participate in that lottery. So stay tuned.
Our next question comes from Harry S. and Wade O. Are candidates with social equity verification required to reapply for approval each subsequent calendar year?
So applicants that have been verified under the social equity criteria may apply for the activities that are listed in the municipal code. And depending on the type of phase and the type of activity, you may have to have a more current verification. We did a verification round in 2019, and then we did another verification round in 2022. In order to participate in the phase 3 retail round 2 lottery, folks did have to get verified under the 2022 criteria. But if you have applied and you have an application pending or a license issued, your verification status is good for that record. However, you may have to reapply for verification if the criteria changes and or council makes a policy decision to change the criteria for applying for the retail storefront activity or non-storefront delivery or any of the other activities that require the equity verification.
Our next question comes from, and it was spelled G-R. I don't know if it was a typo. Maybe it was Jesse R. Apologies. Can I apply for a first-time license? If so, what's the out the door cost?
So the local application fees exceed $10,000 if you're applying for a social equity license. That would cover the legal business entity fee, the equity share review fee, pre-application review fee, and your annual license application, plus the environmental review fee. We do have information about the different application fees on DCR's website, and I would refer you to the website for more information about the different record types that we collect and the associated fees.
Thank you. This is another question from Geese or Jesse. Can I be placed on a wait list for when there's an opportunity for a new license?
DCR does not have a waiting list. Verified social equity individual applicants have the ability to apply for non-storefront delivery, manufacturing, distribution, testing labs. And then general applicants have the ability to apply for manufacturing, distribution, and testing labs directly through the portal. You do have to create a user account through the DCR licensing portal, and then you would have to create a record for the entity that will be pursuing a license, and then you would submit the associated application materials.
Garrett H. asks, when do we receive final CEQA completion so that the state licensing can resume?
So your final CEQA document is not filed until the city makes a determination to issue an annual license. Then and only then will a notice of exemption be filed with the county clerk.
A follow-up from Garrett. How does DCR plan to address Tier 3 social equity plan?
So Tier 3 applicants Those are individuals who themselves don't meet these social equity criteria who participated in the phase 2 round of applications are required to submit a social equity agreement as part of their annual license application. The department will have to review and approve your social equity agreement to basically acknowledge that you've either met the requirements to be a tier 3 applicant or you've partnered with somebody to meet the requirements to be recognized as a tier 3 applicant.
Arnetta, he asks, how can I verify if I qualify for licensing?
I would recommend you visit the DCR licensing page on our website. That will provide a general overview of the licensing information. And depending on the license type you're looking to pursue, you would be able to determine whether or not you meet the criteria for that application type.
Our next question also comes from Arnetta. What is the process for applying for a license?
So all applications are submitted through DCR's licensing portal. There are webinar information and other information available on the DCR website that would provide you with a walkthrough of what the process is, as well as what forms would be needed to initiate that process.
Our question from L. Winston, what advice would you suggest to someone new wanting to enter this industry?
You'll have to read up and get informed on all of the various requirements, both at the local and state level. There's a lot of information available on our website, including prior webinars that we've done, application materials, and information about how to start a commercial cannabis business. Other information as it relates to filing for a business tax registration certificate, filing with the state would be available on those agencies' websites. But a good starting place would be to go to the DCR website and familiarize yourself with the process and what the requirements are.
Thank you, Jason. Lawrence H is asking, how do I get to sell my, or I'm sorry, let me try again. How do I get my license to sell legal marijuana, and how much does it cost to start a legal medical marijuana business?
So in order to sell cannabis to a consumer, you'll have to have a retail license, whether it's retail storefront or non-storefront delivery. For the retail storefronts, application opportunities are made available through a lottery. At this time, we do not have a future lottery date scheduled. For the non-storefront delivery, if you're a verified social equity individual applicant, you can submit an application for that activity. And again, for the retail activity, the local application fees exceed $10,000, and a full list of the fees and the associated services are available on DCR's website.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question comes from Ariella J. When submitting either a license 4004 modification or a license for 4005 modification form, do indirect owners have to be removed, or is it sufficient for only direct owners to be removed?
It really depends on the organizational structure and how it's laid out on the form. But effectively, if you've got an owner and that owner is an entity, by removing that owner, any owners of that entity, which are the indirect owners, would also be removed. So when we're doing ownership removals, either of an owner or an indirect owner, basically by removing somebody at level 1 or level 2, we'll also remove everybody that's below them. And then the expectation would be on your modification form, you would identify where that equity is going and identify any additional owners or indirect owners that need to be added to that legal business entity record.
And then following up again, Ariella J. For owner modification that consists of a change in indirect owners rather than direct owners, is an owner modification invoice still required?
It depends on the amount of equity that is being transferred. If it's 20% or more, or it's a social equity record, then yes, the owner modification invoice is still required. If it's less than 20% and it's not a social equity record, then you would just disclose the change in the equity and it wouldn't trigger a formal ownership modification.
Moving on from Jacqueline L. What is the process for event licensing?
So the city does not currently permit or allow for commercial cannabis events within our jurisdiction. That's something that's still under consideration with the city council and the mayor. So at this time, we do not have an application or licensing process for event licensing.
Thanks, Jason. Jacqueline L. also asks, what do the phases consist of?
Not 100% sure what they're asking. When we talk about our application periods, the phase one application period was for an existing medical marijuana dispensary. Phase two, those were the non-retail suppliers of the existing medical marijuana dispensaries. And then phase three is just general application processing. Within phase three, there's been rounds for the retail storefront activity. There's been different PCN processes and other things. If you're talking about kind of how an application progresses through the application process, it starts with registering the entity that's going to apply for a license. That once that entity is registered through the legal business entity application record, then you would submit a pre-application record. We would do a land use review for the activities you plan to apply for and whether or not it meets our land use requirements. And then if it does, then you have the ability to submit your annual application. And then once you've navigated through the annual application process and you receive an annual license, you can then go and request an operating permit once you've demonstrated that you meet all of the operating requirements. You've got all your permits, including your certificate of occupancy, your health permit, you've got your state licenses. And that's kind of how the general application phasing works.
Our next question comes from Nita M. Excuse me. Do you have an idea of when PCN applicants will be notified of their selection status?
We anticipate that the council file numbers will be issued sometime later this week, and then we'll communicate what those council file numbers are to the PCN applicants. And then from the time that the council file is created, the city council has 90 days to make a finding of public convenience or necessity. If a finding is not made within 90 days, the PCN record will be deemed denied and it will be closed out. So I anticipate that all of the PCN records will be resolved sometime in April.
Anita M. also asks, can PCN ever move to a new location if any problems arise at the existing location chosen as PCN?
The application itself cannot be modified. If a license is issued, then the license can be modified like any other license, subject to the different restrictions that are placed on being able to relocate it within an existing community plan area or moving it to a community plan area that has not reached undue concentration. But the PCN address and the applicant who filed the PCN cannot be modified until such time a license has been issued.
Our next question from Rita W. I'm sorry, Rita Y. Is a current license transferable?
I mean, folks have the ability to submit an entity substitution request to transfer the license opportunity from one entity to another entity, but that entity will have to submit an application and meet all of the application requirements to have a license issued in its name.
Rita Y also asks, how long does it take to get an application approved?
The application process is broken up into a number of record types. Generally, it takes at least 3 to 6 months to navigate through the beginning of the application process to having the application deemed approved and getting a licensing determination. At this point, all applications have to be submitted as annual applications, which requires them to also go through an environmental review and potentially a public hearing. But generally, 3 to 6 months for application processing is a good barometer of time.
Charles M. asks, I submitted my application in 2019 for retail and qualified for the social equity program. I want to understand the process of applying. What do I do about going to the next phase of the process?
I would recommend reaching out to the department to find out what the status of your record is. Generally, if folks were eligible to apply in 2019 and they were part of the application process, most of those folks either have an application that is in process or they've received a license. So if you're unsure where your record is in the process, I would recommend reaching out to the department and providing information so somebody can look it up.
Our next question comes from someone with the initials SM. If our CEQA science amendment was approved by the DCC and we have a provisional and our renewal is awaiting approval from DCR for our annual, what is our next step?
So if you have temporary approval from the Department of Cannabis Regulation or a pending annual license application, staff will be reviewing that for completeness. And once your annual license application is deemed complete, then we'll prepare a report that will be transmitted either to the director or to the Cannabis Regulation Commission. Separately from any environmental review that you've done with the state, as the local jurisdiction, we do have to prepare our own environmental report that will be presented along with the recommendation to either deny the application or to approve the application. And then once a determination has been made, if the determination was to issue a license, then we would file a notice of exemption or the environmental document with the appropriate county or state entity.
A follow-up question from SM. When do we expect to be approved for our annual if we have completed all the steps and submitted all the forms to include the 4013 and the CEQA docs?
It would be sometime later this year. Our team is putting together the required environmental docs based on the completed 4013s. And then once we have deemed the annual license application complete, we have a period of time set by the code to transmit our finding either to the director or to the Cannabis Regulation Commission. And then depending on the type of activity, there may be public hearings or community meetings also involved.
Wendy asks, when or do you have an update on renewals?
So the renewal period is still open. Late renewals are still being accepted, and DCR staff are still continuing to process the renewal information that has come in. We do plan to begin issuing eligible temporary approvals for 2024 records later this month.
Our next question comes from, excuse me, Jason A. Can a type 6 and a type 7 license operate under the same address?
There's no distancing buffer between those two license types, but the city has not accepted any type 7 license applications, nor do we have any operators who are allowed to engage in volatile manufacturing at this time.
From Ariella J. When will DCR release the legal business entity record renewal process to allow an applicant or licensee to update the contact information and ownership without a modification application?
Fairly soon. I expect it will open up sometime later this month, assuming that the renewal records that would be impacted have been processed so that any changes made to the legal business entity record would then get processed against any 2024 records within our system.
Again, from Ariella J. When does DCR expect to start issuing the notice of complete application for applicants who have submitted all required documentation and this is for both retail and non-retail applicants?
So the first batch of the notice of completions are being sent out this month. That batch is primarily focused on the non-retail applications. And then I believe in February or March, we'll start to see the first batch of retail storefront applications be deemed complete. And then that will then trigger the mandatory community meetings as well as the notice for the public hearing that would be held before the Cannabis Regulation Commission.
Our next question comes from Emily H. Will DCR prepare social equity agreements, or do the operators need to prepare such an agreement? And then for phase 2, tier 3 applicants, when will the city require such applicants to enter into social equity agreements and otherwise provide the necessary social equity support for a period of 3 years?
So the applicant needs to prepare their social equity agreement, and it needs to comply with the requirements in the code. We do have a sample agreement that could be utilized by the applicant, but that is going to be an agreement whereby you're acknowledging what your requirements are under the code to be issued a license as a phase 2 tier 3 applicant. Those agreements need to be submitted along with your annual license application. And in order for your application to be deemed complete, it will have to have an approved social equity agreement. And then within that agreement, you will, of course, identify how you're meeting your obligation under the code to provide support for that period of 3 years.
Our next question comes from Emily H. And I think this was asked before. I'll ask it again. When are the current PCN applicants going to be sent to the City Council?
I expect that council file numbers will be issued later this week.
And then from Rachel W. Is the Chatsworth area currently open to type 10 retail storefront license?
The Chatsworth Community Plan area has not reached undue concentration yet.
Rachel W is also asking, if I am an SEIA, do I have the ability to have a type 9 delivery license in the city of Chatsworth?
Social equity individual applicants can apply for the type 9 delivery license in the Chatsworth Community Plan area.
Our next question from MS. What is the general status update on the DCR CEQA review?
I mean, currently DCR personnel are doing the in-house CEQA review for applicants. We have a local jurisdiction assistance grant budget modification pending with the Department of Cannabis Control, which would allow for us to hire outside environmental consultants to complete those reviews to get rid of, the backlog of environmental reviews pending. That has been pending with the DCC since April of 2023. And until and unless the state actually approves the modification, we're not going to be able to bring on those environmental consultants to assist with that process.
The next question comes from Ariella J. Is there a process for increasing cultivation license size for existing licenses since the physical modification limits you to your existing license size?
To modify the size of a cultivation license would be done either through a business premises diagram or a business premises relocation request, depending on what you're trying to do to increase that footprint. If you're going to stacked beds, it would go within a business premises modification request. And if you're looking at expanding your physical footprint into an adjacent unit or units, depending on that size change, it may require a re-review of the land use to make sure that it's properly distanced, which would be handled through a relocation request.
Thank you. From MS. When will DCR start accepting online payments for their invoices?
Hopefully by June 30th of this year.
Moving on from Christian, what is the status with the DCR licensing map? Is the DCR licensing map updated with current sensitive uses and all retail pre-applications, retail pending, retail temporary approval / authorized addresses?
The retail layers are going to be refreshed later this week. So I expect by the 15th, everything will be up to date based on data through the beginning of January. For the sensitive uses, Google changed the amount of data that can be included in any one layer. So we're still working with our systems group to figure out a way to put the data into layers so that it's easily managed within kind of the confines of the Google API. If we're unable to do it within the Google Map solution, we'll have to then go back and transition back to the Department of City Planning, posting it on our behalf through ArcGIS.
Another question from MS. Will DCR be implementing a function where applicants can see who the analyst is for the record, for each record?
Yes.
Thank you. Moving on from Jeremiah W. When will DCR begin the application process for consumption lounges, and will us social equity members have an opportunity to apply first?
So DCR does not currently have the authority to accept applications for consumption lounges. The policy decision on whether or not the city will authorize consumption lounges is still pending with the city council and the mayor. So, if ultimately a decision is made to allow DCR to accept that application type, we would provide information. And then, of course, whether or not it would be restricted to any applicant group would also be a policy consideration that has yet to be made.
From MS, if I submitted a PCN request that is an area no longer unduly concentrated, can my PCN request still be approved?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Sure. If I submitted a PCN request and that area is no longer unduly concentrated, can my PCN request still be approved?
I will actually have to talk with the city attorney's office about that. I mean, from a point in time snapshot, when the PCN requests were initially reviewed and determined eligible for further processing, those requests were within areas that were subject to a finding of undue concentration. So I don't know if this is a hypothetical or a real life situation, but if something's pending before the city council, you know, it's still their prerogative to make the necessary finding. And I'll have to ask whether or not they can make that finding if a CPA actually falls below the undue concentration threshold. So I don't have a definitive answer to that question.
I think we're good, Jason.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank everybody for coming today, and our next Q&A virtual lunch will be on Wednesday, February 14th at noon. So I look forward to answering more questions then. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day. Bye.